Welcome everyone to the first webinar of 2021 for the KPSRL. We're very excited to have everyone here. My name is Megan Price. I'm the head of Secretariat here at the Knowledge Platform for Security and Rule of Law. And we are joined today by Leo Gahan from GRIP, which is the Group for Research and Information on Peace and Security. I'm going to lay down a few ground rules first, just to get us all on the same page. Please make sure that your microphone is muted and remains muted while we're having the presentation, and also during the Q&A. I'll provide kind of the ground rules for Q&A then. We would love to have your mics on, your cameras on though, please. It definitely helps to provide an atmosphere of community and conversation. So you can have it off during the presentation, but when we begin the Q&A, it's great to have cameras on to really see who's around the table here, the virtual table in any case. I also want to mention for everyone's awareness that this session is being recorded. That allows us to provide the session online for those of our community who weren't able to make it today. It allows them to get to benefit from the information shared herein. So please be aware that it is being recorded. The participants list is not recorded, nor is the chat. So if you feel that you would like to submit information anonymously, either of those places, you're able to do so. With that in mind, rather than do a round of introductions of everyone who's in the room, I would invite you, for those comfortable, to introduce yourself in the chat. Just say who you are, perhaps what organization you're affiliated with, and what you're looking forward to learning today. That helps provide a little bit more context for the group in terms of who's around the table. Our expectations for today, we really are excited because this topic about for today, which is looking at how do we inform security and rule of law policies, how do we do that in a responsible way, how do we do that in a way that is effective, that gets decision makers and policymakers' attention, helps to help them understand the decisions that they're making, the consequences of those decisions. How do we do that in an era where the news, social media is simply inundating us with unfiltered information? How do we make sure that we are getting the right kind of information to the right person in the right way? So this is something that's very near and dear to the heart of the KPSRL, and something that we're really excited about talking with, specifically with Leo, because this is something he's been focusing on, and part of his KMF, his Knowledge Management Fund project, focused specifically on that. I'm going to go into that in a bit. So today we're going to explore the steps to build knowledge and present it to policymakers based on GRIP's research and their own experience. We're going to discuss how to build confidence with policymakers when sharing your research or your knowledge. And we're going to explore the tools to kind of look beyond simply the most, let's say, traditional policymakers. Who else out there is important to carry your message? And how do we support the social aspect that goes along with policymaking? Because we need to remind ourselves that it's not simply the ministries that make policy, it's also the public that needs to understand and support policy in order for those policies to be sustainable. So with that, I would like to introduce Leo Gahan. He is a researcher at the Group for Research and Information on Peace and Security, otherwise abbreviated as GRIP. GRIP is an independent research center. It was created in 1979. It's based in Brussels in Belgium. And their main aims are to study, research and gain information and provide training on peace, defense, and disarmament, with a view to improving international security in Europe and throughout the world. Now, we've been in touch with Leo through his Knowledge Management Fund project, his KMF. These are small, innovative projects that we at the KPSRL fund. I would encourage those who are interested to learn more to go to our website. You can find out about the KMF. Leo conducted a project that was specifically focusing on policies that were needing to be taken up within Mali, specifically on legal arms ownership and how to align Malian law with ECOWAS law and what were the implications thereof. When doing this research, Leo and GRIP were very, very conscientious about their target audience within legislation and the legislative arms of the Malian government, how to speak to legislators, how to get them involved in understanding the work and the research that Leo was doing and why that research would be relevant to them. So that's one of the experiences that Leo is going to refer to today as he talks a little bit more about informing policymakers. So with that, and without further ado, I want to make sure to turn to Leo with plenty of time. We expect the presentation to run around 20 minutes, and then that should provide us with plenty of time for Q&A. So please do keep your questions ready for afterwards, because we'll have an opportunity to have discussion following the presentation. With that, Leo, I gladly turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Megan, for this kind introduction, and many more thanks for hosting me today. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us as well today. I am going to talk about how to inform policies in the field of security and rule of law from the perspective of research organizations. So starting with self-evidence, decision makers do not take decisions or actions completely isolated from the outside world. Deciding on a policy requires to have a good understanding of the phenomenon and of the dynamics it addresses, and of the various stakeholders involved. But public administrations, political advisors are not necessarily tasked with or capable to producing analysis, to producing recommendations, at least not with the same breadth of expression as non-state organizations do. That's why policymakers rely on a wide range of external actors in order to get data, in order to get information, in order to get knowledge, such as research organizations like GRIP, for instance, and many others. The trend, I think, is all the more striking as non-state organizations have been increasingly involved in the exploration of policies that were long believed to be the state's exclusive domains, such as defense, security, and rule of law. But the explosion of instant, of fake or half fake news has forced and is forcing research organizations, I think, to reflect on how to build efficient and robust policy shaping, policy informing processes in order to ensure credibility, but also to distance themselves from the mere news dropping activity. So informing policy comprises two dimensions, I guess. The first is producing knowledge. The second is disseminating knowledge. And the notion of producing knowledge is important because it refers to the process by which raw materials or facts, so what I would call data, are given a signification that helps the recipient, so the policymakers, understand, frame, assess, and decide on a particular problem or on a particular phenomenon. And disseminating knowledge is just the process through which the knowledge's signification is communicated to policymakers. So in order to reflect on those two dimensions and more generally on how to inform policies, I would like to address three questions today. The first question would be how to move from collecting data to organizing it and presenting finally knowledge to policymakers. The second would be how to instill trust in your data, how to make sure that your project, your research does not suffer from misconceptions, from misunderstandings that can actually derive from fake news. And the third would be how to identify allies in order to reach out to policymakers, of course, but also to contribute to the social acceptance of the policies you are defending. And on this topic, it means that we also need to identify allies to reach out to the wider population, or at least key parts, key components of the population. I just wanted to say that by policymakers, I mean decision makers, but also implementing agencies, so public administrations, and law enforcement agencies. And I will use examples from past projects that we conducted at GRIP, mostly pertaining to providing support to West African countries in the technical and legal implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. And the Arms Trade Treaty is an international treaty regulating legal arms transfers, so exports, imports, transit, transshipment, brokering. So moving to the first part, how to move from collecting data to presenting knowledge. I think that there are three criteria we try to keep in mind when producing knowledge. The first is focusing on relevance. Data or knowledge should be relevant, of course, rather than just interesting or new. And by relevant, I mean that it should help the policymaker perform a specific task. It must be actionable in the sense that policymakers must be able to attribute knowledge a role in his or her decision-making process with no need to refine it further. So what I call being a piece in the decision-making process. To do so, the important thing is to have, from the very beginning of your project, a good understanding of the policymaker's job description, what are their tasks, what are their position, what time do they have to perform the tasks, and maybe most important, what are their working procedures? What are the methodologies they use in order to reach decision? To illustrate my point, I would like to mention the case of arms exports. GRIP assists one EU government in making sure that its arms exports will not violate its European and international commitments in terms, for instance, of human rights. So we conduct risk assessments where we analyze the importing countries' record in human rights violations. But we do not collect all data and facts pertaining to all human rights violations. We only collect data and facts on human rights violations that have a link with arms exports. So those that the arms exports officers will be able to process through their assessment methodology. Concretely, it means that we will only collect human rights violations pertaining to weapons, pertaining to arms exports. And for instance, let's say that the passing of discriminatory laws based on sexual orientation in one importing country will not be considered relevant, will not be considered as part of the risk assessment that we conduct, because it has actually no bearing and it has no links with arms exports per se. So second criterion that I would like to explore, trying to produce dynamic knowledge. So here, there is added value when data can document a relationship between two or more phenomena or two or more variables instead of describing each one separately. Why? Because explaining the effect of one variable onto another is like showing policymakers where to act. If you act on this variable, you will have effects and consequences on this other variable and this wider phenomenon. Gun violence, I think, is a case in point here, because every government is interested in preventing and tackling gun violence, I think. But policies and responses will vary widely depending on the relationship between gun violence and other variables, depending on the contributing factors that lead to gun violence. So let's take the example of country X, where gun violence is mostly committed with legally owned weapons. So there, the authorities that want to curb the phenomenon may consider stricter requirements on buying weapons, so requiring stricter ID proofs, for instance. They can also consider putting more restrictions on public carrying of weapons, or they can also impose stricter limitations on the types of firearms that are legally available. But now let's take the case of country Y, where gun violence is mostly committed with illegally owned firearms. So there, the authorities will rather consider how to strengthen police capabilities to detect and dismantle trafficking rings, how to strengthen international cooperation with other countries, and how to impose tougher penalties with a view to deter traffickers from selling weapons illegally. So as you can see, these two sets of policies, depending on whether gun violence is rather fueled by legal arms trade or legal arms detention or illegally owned weapons, are actually different. And I think this is what policymakers and law enforcement agencies will be interested in. Not knowledge about gun violence itself, but knowledge about gun violence and its causal correlative relationships. And third, trying to suggest a course of action. It may be useful, for instance, to present research findings under the form of a roadmap. So a roadmap would be a table with 3 columns, at least 3 columns. The first column would be describing what the policymakers want to achieve on a certain topic, so the final situation they want to reach. The second column would describe what policymakers have already managed to do, so the actual situation. And logically, the third column would describe the steps needed to fill the gap between actual and expected situations. So moving now to the second part, and trying to transition, the more you think like a policymaker, the more likely you are to produce relevant knowledge. The more likely you are to capture their attention, the more likely you are to capture their assumption, to capture their bias, and to instill trust in your project. And this is the second part. I am now trying to insist on that because your ability to inform policies can be hampered by a lack of trust in your research from policymakers. And this lack of trust can actually derive from three types of misunderstandings, of three types of problem that I have actually labeled as first, a misunderstanding on your organization's identity or your organization's intentions, so who you are. Second, what I called a misunderstanding on the policy you are defending, so actually a lack of understanding from the policymakers on why the policy you are trying to inform concern them, why is it relevant to their priorities and needs. And the third misunderstanding would be a misunderstanding about the just the languages, that the vocabularies that both would use. You as a research organization would use a certain vocabulary center language to discuss a topic. Policymakers would use a completely different one, and that would create misunderstanding. Melissa, I'm just sorry, I cannot put my slides.
Oh, are you not able to go to the next slide?
No, I can't.
Okay, I can take that over if you'd like. If you stop sharing your screen, I'll start sharing it on my side. Is that working?
Yes, can you just, next slide, please?
Yes. Sorry. Is this the one you're looking for?
Yes, this is the next one. Okay, great. Yeah, so apologies for this small delay. So I was referring to three types of misunderstanding that can instill a lack of trust in your project and in your findings. So the first is about your organization identity and intentions. When you have reached the point of presenting your research findings to policymakers, dedicate some time to clearly introduce your organization, its possible affiliation to other entities, and the framework of your project, so as to avoid any misunderstandings on why you are here and for what purposes. I'm taking an example that happened to us during one workshop on the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. We realized after one day of workshop that certain policymakers present thought that we were an offshoot of the Secretariat of the Arms Trade Treaty, and that because of that affiliation, we were actually trying to lobby them in order to implement the treaty in a certain manner, while actually we were just mandated by their government in order to provide with technical support in the implementation of this treaty. So we clearly had to correct that in the second day of workshop, but this cost us actually quite a good amount of time that could have been used in order to present more in details our project's findings. So this is about being sure that the policymakers understand that you are here for certain purposes, so research purposes, policy informing, and that you are not trying to act to lobby undercover or to do other sort of activities. This is what I call trying to ensure corporate transparency. Very important to have a good that they have a good understanding of your organization's past, fundamental options, whatever information leads to transparency. So second, what I call what's the matter. So here the important thing is try to connect your project to the local realities. the objective here would be to have policymakers think, okay, I wasn't familiar with the topic this organization is showing to me. I wasn't familiar with the policy, but I know that I see that it concerns my country. It is relevant to our priorities. Here again, we have realized during one of our workshops in the beginning that policymakers thought that the Arms Trade Treaty was of no relevance to them, because they told us, okay, our security priorities here in this country are about curbing arms trafficking and small arms and light weapons trafficking. So why are you coming with the implementation of a treaty that concerns legal arms trades and that concerns actually all conventional weapons? So we had actually to explain to them that if you implement this treaty correctly, in a fully and efficient manner, you will have a better view of what is legal and illegal in your country. So you will have actually better monitoring capabilities also for arms trafficking. You will end up having a stronger legal framework, and you will improve your law enforcement agencies' efficiency in fighting arms trafficking. So we had to take the subject, we had to take the policy, and we had to make sure that it connected to their priority needs. And the third type of misunderstanding that could lead to a mistrust or distrust is a difference of languages employed. The diplomatic language of an international treaty, of a regional convention, can be light years from the language employed by national policymakers to discuss the exact same topic. So here again, during one of the workshops I just mentioned, there were military officers that did not understand why a treaty that was called the Arms Trade Treaty also covered in its scope military equipment that were not weapons per se. So actually, armored personnel carriers, which are military vehicles that are used to transport troops and that are normally unarmed, they did not understand why it covered these vehicles as well. And because of that, they had a negative opinion about the treaty, thinking that it would prevent them from acquiring military equipment and preventing them from fulfilling their needs in terms of defense and security. So I think we need to try as much as possible to translate the key terms and ideas of our project, of our knowledge, in our audience's vocabulary. So after that, there is, of course, one big thing to do. It's to try to find allies in your campaign to inform policy, to reach out to both decision makers and the wider population. So, of course, it's important because I think as a research organization, our work mostly focuses on technical or legal work, issues, advice, but it requires us also to convince policymakers and the society of the benefits that the policies we are defending can yield. If a law or if a policy is adopted, but is immediately rejected by the population, so by those who are subject to the policy, then it remains an empty vessel. So how to reach out to all those who can contribute to the social acceptance of the policies or of the laws? First, finding allies to reach decision makers. If your organization is not herself acquainted with the target, the recipient country's political authorities, it is crucial to find a broker organization. So a broker organization would be an organization that put you in touch with the decision makers in the recipient country first, that will provide you political, if not material support and legitimacy to your project. And this organization can be either the UN permanent delegation of the recipient country that you target in your project. It can be an NGO having strong links with local decision makers, for instance, the parliamentary forum, or it can be a governmental agency in the recipient country that act as an international focal point on a certain theme or in a certain area. So dedicating time to find this broker organization is crucial, I think, as part of the project's conception. And as far as we're concerned, we work a lot with governmental agencies that act as focal points for matters relating to legal arms trade or arms trafficking. Actually, states parties to international instruments, conventions, are usually required to designate these sort of agencies, acting as a focal point to exchange information on the treaties or conventions implementation. And given the very nature of information exchange providers, these focal points organizations are usually easy, or I should say easier to get in touch for external organizations such as research centers. Usually their contact details are indicated on the website of their ministry of affiliation. So they're easy to get in touch, and they constitute a good entry door into the political milieu of the target country. However, another important point is that these broker organizations should have a minimum of political leverage in their own country. So they must be familiar with the communication protocols to reach out to decision makers, and they must have sufficient authority to get feedback from them. So if you want to organize a workshop with representatives from several different ministries, this broker organization must be able to be sure that these representatives will join the meeting. So in order to, I would say, maximize chances that this happen, we try to work with agencies that belong to either the prime ministry or the presidency of the country, rather than just one single area ministry, such as the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Internal Security, simply because there can be competition between those two ministries in terms of security and defense areas. So now turning to finding allies to reach out to the population. Here again, security and rule of law policies are sensitive issues because they deal with the physical security of people and the social cohesion. So it's important to make sure that those policies you're trying to inform are well understood, properly understood by the population, or at least by key components of it, and that they are not tarnished by news, fake news, misinformation, mistrust, distrust, coming from different interest groups. So there are two options here. The first option that I see is to try to find a second kind of broker organization within the civil society. So here by civil society, I mean advocacy or professional associations, because they know the social codes, they know the networks, they know the concerns of the population in the recipient country. And I also include organizations that initially can be opposed to the policy that you are defending. Why is it important to discuss your project's finding with them? I think because it can also help dissipate their own misconceptions about the policy. And in the end, they can be turned, if not as allies, at least as neutral magnets. So, for instance, we invited hunting brotherhood organizations during one of the workshops we held about the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. These hunting brotherhood organizations were initially very opposed and hostile to the treaty because they thought that the treaty would prevent them from acquiring and using weapons for hunting purposes. So we had to convince them, and we managed to do it, at least to a certain extent, to tell, and we managed to convince them that actually it would not be the case, and that precisely by quoting the treaty's text and recitals, their rights to bear, to acquire, and to use weapons for cultural purposes, including hunting, would be guaranteed by the treaty. So once we did this, they somewhat changed their minds, and they asked us to provide them with the treaty's text so that they could translate it into their local language in order to raise awareness of their wider community about the treaty's provisions. And apart from civil society as groups, lawmakers, I think, can also be an alternative because they combine the legitimacy of elections, provided that there are elections, of course, and normally a good grasp of their constituencies. So instead of considering them as lawmakers only, they can also be engaged as awareness-raising agents. In the end, lawmakers will be the ones who will adopt or vote policies and laws in a certain number of areas. So they also have a good grasp or what the law is and is not. So and they can be actually the most useful people in order to convince the wider population that the law is not going to do that to you, but the law has an objective, this or this goal. They are actually the ones that can be that can prove more efficient, more effective in raising awareness of the population. And for that matter, engaging fresh lawmakers, so just after Parliament's renewal, for instance, may prove more effective because lawmakers in that case are expected to still have a fresh connection with their constituencies from the time they were campaigning. And that's all for me. I leave it here. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Leo, for the comprehensive overview of kind of the approach that GRIP takes in instilling trust and building up relationships with decision makers in informing them with your research. One thing that I particularly appreciated, and one thing that we really took note of with the KMF, was your approach with lawmakers, specifically because of that dual role that they play, both as decision makers and the way that they vote on policy, but also the way in which they communicate those policies to their constituents and the relationship that they have with their constituents, so they can play kind of a dual vector role in that way. We found that really interesting. I'm going to turn it now to the group. So now that we are moving to the Q&A, I would welcome anyone and everyone who is comfortable to turn your cameras on. Please do so. It helps create more of a conversational atmosphere. Please do be aware, again, we are recording. So if you would like to raise your hand and voice your question out loud, please know that your image and your voice will be captured in the recording. There are two ways to submit questions to the speaker. You can raise your hand. I've been told or made aware recently that due to some Zoom updates, the raising hands is now in potentially two places. So it can either be at the bottom of the participants list. So you open up the participants list and it should be at the bottom of that. It should say raise hands. Or if you've recently updated Zoom, the option will be in your reactions. So you'll have a little smiley face at the bottom of your menu there. One of the reactions is to raise your hand. An alternative to raising your hand and voicing your question directly is to simply submit your question anonymously to the KPSRL Secretariat. You can do that in the chat. So just submit your question via the chat anonymously, and that way we can also ensure that if people are not comfortable voicing their question aloud, that there's still a way for you to participate. With that, I'm going to open it up to anyone who has a question for Leo on his presentation or would like him to elaborate any further on some of the examples or the points that he made. And Melissa, please let us know if there's anyone who has submitted a question via the chat. Dominic, I see your hand. Dominic, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks, Megan, and thanks, Leo, for a really, really interesting presentation. Especially appreciated all the examples that you gave. That was very helpful. I wonder if you could just expand a bit on the notion of fake news in this context. Is that evidence can be sort of endlessly criticized and contested? Is it that findings will be, critiqued from all sorts of good or bad faith points of view? Just wondering what you mean by that phrase in this context.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So actually, I should say maybe the two of the options you mentioned. I think that as far as Greek experience is concerned, I would say that it's a bit of a combination of, for instance, pre-existing fake news that would have been embraced by some policymakers regarding the topic that we are talking about, that would then actually influence their opinion on our findings. I'm explaining that. During one of the workshops that we hold and that I talked about, very early in the workshop, the first day of workshop, about the Arms Trade Treaty implementation, some policymakers and some military officers openly said and thought that there was an arms embargo from the European Union on their country, active, valid at the time we were holding the workshop, which was absolutely wrong, and there was no evidence of that. Like, this is really something that could not have been substantiated by any information. Because of this pre-existing, I would say, misinformation, they were suspicious about why we were trying to implement the Arms Trade Treaty. I mean, why their authorities were trying to implement the Arms Trade Treaty, and why we were here as a European research center in order to support their country to do so. So they were suspicious, and they raised these suspicions quite openly on, okay, are you not just trying to go further and go deeper into the arms embargo? So we really had to try to just diffuse this fiction that there was an arms embargo and that the Arms Trade Treaty was something totally different that was unrelated to the political decisions that any country can take in the European Union, and so on and so forth. So I would say that, yes, it's actually pre-existing fake news that would then prevent them from maybe interpreting our research findings in a very objective manner.
Thank you.
Maybe to build on that a little bit, Leo, have you found the particular ways of approaching misinformation? I mean, how is it that you're able to build the credibility you need to overcome those misconceptions, especially when it's almost impossible to substantiate or argue against fake news? Sometimes it can be impossible to prove a negative. What is it about the relationship that GRIP builds helps you overcome that situation?
Well, on that, from my own and young experience, I would say that one thing that we try to do is that at the beginning of the dissemination phase of the project, we really try actually after our first or second presentations to give the floor to the audience so that they have very general comments about the topic or the project. And what we actually noticed is that during this phase of some sort of Q&A phase session, a lot of people would actually come up with, I would say, maybe disputed claims or maybe misconceptions about the topics. But then we would actually have a dedicated session, dedicated time in order to see, okay, so this is where they stand on this topic, we can maybe try to answer to their claims or try to dissipate their fears on these questions. And this is what we've done. Actually, during these sort of sessions, we just try to, I would say that, to reassure people, because usually, I mean, as far as we are concerned, again, the fake news or the misconceptions relate about you actually are here to encroach on our sovereignty on this topic, security and rule of law. So if you can make sure, or at least if you can try to show that, no, you're not going to encroach on their sovereignty, they will remain absolutely sovereign in dealing with the matters that we are discussing, it can help. It can help dissipate or contain the fake news effect. And what I would say also is that, usually, I mean, again, from my experience, these fake news were actually raised by a limited number of people, maybe 2 or 3 people in the audience. So if you can actually manage to answer to these people, not to convince them, but to convince the others that what they are saying is not true or is disputed or is irrelevant in the framework of the project, it can also be a way to just try to limit the spillover effects of fake news. So I would say trying to dedicate a session on just listening to people's fears that can be legitimate fears, and then trying to just dispel with that as much as possible.
Thanks for that elaboration. Victoria, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much. This is Victoria calling from Berlin, from the SSR hub between Federal Foreign Office of Germany and Hamburg Research Institute. I'm quite sure you had a short introduction round in the beginning, and I missed that because I was a bit late. Sorry for that. Leo, thanks so much for your presentation. My question would be a bit in the direction of misinformation, but with a hint on what we discussed at this year's KPSRL annual conference, where we had the issue that we not only have highly contested fields, with misinformation and fake news where people discuss a lot, but there are also touchy subjects where especially governments sometimes, act in an area of plausible deniability and trying to keep information from them. And my question would be, do you have any experience with how to address, how to make them talk about the subjects they'd rather not talk about? Do you go via civil society, or do you talk to different government agencies? If you could elaborate on that, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting question. What we've tried to do on that mostly pertain to how we define the communication settings with policymakers, so how we disseminate our findings in the end. I must say that what has worked to a certain extent in order to extract information, sensitive information from policymakers, was actually to keep them separate from the civil society. So we would hold workshops, one workshop with policymakers and another workshop with the civil society. And even actually, we would actually cut the workshop with policymakers in two, one with military officers and the other one with representatives from the government. And we tried also to keep a limited number of people there so that people can express, and I think in that case, at least in that case, it brought about more frantic talks about the topic, and it allowed us to really capture the audience's feelings about the topic. I think that I also had the opposite experience of mixing civil society organizations and lawmakers and decision makers. I must say that still in my little experience, it proved less efficient in terms of having policymakers getting information, simply because I think the policymakers present were kind of, I don't know, they were just reluctant to give the civil society information that they could use maybe against them later in the day or later after the workshop. So they would remain quite muted with very just general speeches. So I would say that maybe the more limited the workshop size, maybe the better, at least as far as we are concerned. And yes, that's it.
Great. No, thanks very much. Melissa, I understand that we have a anonymously submitted question. Why don't you go ahead?
Yes. Okay. This question is, what happens in cases where the policymakers or authorities are hostile to the kind of work that's done by researchers or organizations, especially on key issues such as security, defense, and rule of law? Do you face such hostility? And this asker also wants to know about your own physical security in a context like Mali.
Okay, thank you. When it comes to physical security, I must say that, I mean, we've never had problems so far. Actually, it hasn't been I mean, of course, like we've reflected on how to be sure that nor myself, neither my colleague would be facing the risk of being physically harmed or injured. But still, when it comes to Mali, our trips remain limited to Bamako. So it was I think the most or the least insecure part of the country, and we were actually quite confident into the possibilities of hosting a workshop with no physical threats, at least no directly. I must also say that working with the broker organization, as I mentioned, is also helpful in terms of assessing, you know, any sort of threats, any sort of problems that you could face once you are on board or once you have landed in Mali. So in this case, the broker organization we have worked with is a mixed organization that has both civilian and military officers. And most of the people we were in touch with and that helped us with the project were military officers or police officers that were also somewhat connected to the bigger picture about their security in their country. So they could also help us to just be sure that we were not organizing something that could have turned bad. Once I was in Mali, every day for any of my interview and other things, I was actually I had a driver that was part of the broker organization, who was a military officer. So I didn't really travel myself alone in Bamako, but still, we haven't faced any problems so far. But it's clearly something that we are reflecting on a lot for future projects, because we see that security is deteriorating in a certain number of countries that we work with or that we have worked with in the past. So we're trying to figure it out. We haven't had a definitive answer yet, so how to ensure this security. Maybe when it comes to hostility by policymakers, indeed, we have faced hostility and open hostility from certain policymakers in the course of these projects that we've just discussed. I think that, well, the first thing is to remain cool-headed in any circumstances, to really ensure that you are diplomatic, you keep things in a very polite way. And I have actually noticed that by just answering to them in a very fact-grounded and very diplomatic speaking, would actually diffuse some of the hostility that they could have before. As I touched upon, their hostility was mainly reflecting fears about encroachment on their sovereignties. So it was mostly about, okay, this GRIP organization, like, who is funding them? Why are they here? And what exactly are they trying to extract from us? Like, are they really just there in order to get sure that we are going to implement the treaty in the way they want, or are they just there to propose us options in order to implement the treaty? And once you have managed to try to dissipate these sovereignties fears, actually things are going better and the hostility is dissipating a bit. This is what we've tried to do with, of course, a clear, I would say that, with the clear awareness that we would not convince every of them that, okay, the policy we're defending and in trying to inform was relevant. But at least we really presented them with objective and I would say fact-grounded arguments to support it. And this is what actually we have tried to do, just to remain as less suspicious as possible.
Thanks very much, Leo, for that reflection. I'm wondering actually if this is an area where more people in our audience actually might have had experience. Is there anyone who would like to share their own reflections on an opportunity, or let's say an experience where the presentation of research to a potential policymaker or decision maker was met with hostility? And are there ways in which diffusing the situation or allowing the situation to be channeled elsewhere in another way proved helpful? I am particularly, struck by your point, Leo, on the sensitivity of the sovereignty issue. And I think that that's particularly relevant here, given that that GRIP performs its research from the basis of Brussels, but does actually make a very strong attempt and effort to work directly with governments of development partner countries. So I'm wondering, how does that power dynamic inform the way in which you approach these informing relationships? I'm sure that must come up. I don't know, Leo, if you have a direct response on the power dynamic there. It was an invitation for others as well, if others have comments.
Okay, shall I? So actually trying to figure out what are the sensitivities of the recipient or the partner countries. I think that, yeah, there are maybe two things I would like to mention here. Here again, one good entry door in the recipient country and what good entry door into gauging the level of sensitivity of the topics is to try to work in first place with a governmental agency that is mostly a technical agency. So an agency that wouldn't be sensitive or wouldn't be linked to political matters, at least not high level political matters. Working with this organization in Mali that is called the CNL-PAL, so c'est Commission Nationale de Lutte contre la Prolifération des Armes Légères, was actually very helpful for us because it would actually help us to understand to what extent not them, but their higher-ups, the policymakers that we will actually reach at the end of the project, would be concerned about the topic, would be informed about the topic, or would even be maybe having some sort of mistrust or distrust towards our organization or towards the topic, towards the policy. I remember that during our first trip to Mali for one of the projects, we actually had a bit of a talk with this broker organization, the CNL-PAL, that was just intended to get their feelings about the general mindset of the policymakers concerned by the project regarding the topic, of course, and also more generally regarding like the research organization's work. What was good for us is that, I mean, of course, it's not just only Mali, but they were, both the broker organization and their Ministry of Affiliation, were actually used to work with external partner, technical foreign agencies, and so on and so forth. So we were not just coming here as the first research organization dealing on this topic. They were quite informed about what GRIP could do as a work. But still, once we were before them in the audience, we had to clarify certain things. Then there was also maybe a second point I would like to address. It is that by policymakers, actually, we mean a lot of things. There can be a lot of different people. And as I said, we met both decision makers, we met also military officers, and their level of awareness is actually different. Their level of maybe pre-existing suspicion is also different. We found people that, we met people that were actually not suspicious at all, and some of us that were, and that we really had to make sure that they at least changed a bit their mind. So I think that the more you can get in touch, try to enter, try to gauge the political sensitivity and the general atmosphere in the target country before you start your dissemination phase, and the higher chances you will have to at least be aware of that hostility and better answer it, I'd say.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to give one more final opportunity. If anyone would like to raise a question or submit one. Melissa, do we have any anonymous questions submitted at this point?
We do have one anonymous question.
Okay, I will give everyone a 3-second pause if you want to raise your hand. This was your last chance. Okay, Melissa, please go ahead and read out the final question.
All right. Leo, are there defense or security issues that policymakers particularly request input or support from research organizations?
Yeah. Okay, so what we can actually say about that, and in my experience, there are actually certain policy issues that decision makers are likely to ask research organizations for support. The first is how to build efficient data collection system. So in a number of areas, in a number of policy issues within the field of security and defense, there are international instruments or regional conventions, regional instruments that set goals, as you know. So for instance, all the sustainable development goals, and usually these instruments also ask the state parties to report on progress regarding the achievement of the goals. But to report on the progress means that you must have a data collection system that allows you to say, okay, I can report the information you ask from me. And for instance, I think SDG 16.4 that aims to significantly reduce illicit financial trafficking and illicit arms flows by 2030 proposes actually one of these indicators. When it comes to the illicit arms flows, the proposed indicator is to report on the number of seized and traced weapons every year. But actually, not all the states parties, not all the states that try to reach the sustainable development goals have the human capabilities or the technical capabilities to report on seized and traced weapons. Maybe they are actually even not able to trace weapons in the entire process. So this is one of the areas where they ask for support in how to build strong data collection system. And I think that this can also apply to other areas, such as, for instance, gender-based violence. How to report on gender-based violence, I think is quite a tricky issue, depending on the scope of it, how to measure it, and so on and so forth. Apart from that, what we've been doing a lot as well is supporting the translation of international laws instruments or international or regional conventions, legal, regional or international instruments into national laws and policies. So how to make sure that the national law of one country is in line with the international instrument they've just ratified. And this is quite a technical task, I would say, because it requires us from drawing lists of items, really making some legal advice or very technical advice to them.
Excellent, excellent points, Leo. With that, I'm conscious of the time. So at this point, I'm going to close the conversation. There will be an opportunity, if you did not get to ask your question, we will be posting and sharing the contact details of Leo, so you can follow up with him directly if you have a question. I want to, first of all, thank Leo very much for your time, for the knowledge that you've shared. There've been some really, I think, very helpful points of advice. The perspective you have on building relationships of trust in the partner countries. I think your points on trying to present information to technical partners, to brokers, and to focusing on the technical partners. I think a lot of us understand that even if it sounds technical or it sounds very boring, oftentimes it has very political implications. So perhaps that's a better route to approach a policy, is to really approach it or attack it at its technical core and understand what are the mechanisms that lead to a undesirable political situation, and can we focus the conversation around those perhaps more dry and technical aspects of it. And that also kind of helps us navigate that space a little bit more directly. And your point about setting up the data collection systems, that in and of itself can be a counteract to a lot of the misinformation that seems to proliferate in these environments where the resources struggle to meet the needs for data collection. So setting these kind of these systems up can actually then in themselves help create a better environment for information to flow. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your attention and your time. We are going to post Leo's contact details at the end of the session. Also, you will be receiving from us a request for feedback. We really do use the survey feedback to help shape and steer these webinars. It also gives you an opportunity to provide ideas of future webinars. So please do reach out to us at the KPSRL Secretariat if you have an idea for a webinar, and we would love to hear how you experienced this particular webinar. Please maybe also check your other folders. Sometimes if you're not on our mailing list, the survey will go to an other folder, let's call it. With that, one more time to say thank you very much to Leo and to all of you for your time and attention, and I wish you a very good evening.